Today I want to tell a story that, had it not been recounted by someone who worked for years in a crematorium, would likely be dismissed as just another urban legend. But sometimes, there are accounts so strange, that even those who lived through them spend the rest of their lives trying to find an explanation. It all began on a seemingly ordinary night. It was just past 3 in the morning when a man returned from work. He had spent over 7 years working at a municipal crematorium. During that time, he had seen practically everything one could imagine. Accidents. Children. The elderly. Families shattered by grief. As the years went by, it ceased to be shocking and became part of his routine. Just as a cook gets used to the heat of the kitchen or a mechanic to the smell of oil, he learned to live with death on a daily basis. But that night, something had broken that routine. When he walked through the front door, his own son took a few seconds to recognize him. His face was deathly pale. His hands trembled as he tried to take off his shoes. His eyes, usually steady, seemed to be searching for something invisible inside the house. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was fear. Real fear. His son found it strange right away. In the first few months after his father started working at the crematorium, he used to come home shaken. He would sit at the table, pour himself a shot of vodka, and tell stories that were hard to hear. He spoke of children he had cremated. Of parents who could barely stay on their feet during the final farewell. Of people staring into the void as they watched the coffin disappear behind the furnace doors for the last time. Back then, every cremation seemed to weigh on his conscience. But time did what it always does. Little by little, he learned to bear that reality. The family's tears no longer followed him home. The drink had started to appear less and less. And work had become just work. That's why seeing him in that state after so many years was completely out of the ordinary. His son walked over to him. "Dad, did something happen?" Without answering, he simply looked away and walked silently into the kitchen. He opened the fridge. He took out a bottle of vodka. He poured a full glass. He drank it all in one go. That was enough for the son to realize that something had truly happened. In recent years, his father only turned back to drink when facing situations even he couldn't process. A few moments later, his mother woke up too. Still groggy, she walked into the kitchen, assuming her husband had simply come home late from work. But one look at his face was enough to tell her something was terribly wrong. "What happened to you?" He tried to answer. He opened his mouth a few times. The words simply wouldn't come out. His eyes darted back and forth, as if reliving every detail of that night. After a few seconds of silence, he took a deep breath. I don't even know if you could call this a work problem." He paused again. He ran a hand over his face. And began to tell the story. It had all started at the beginning of his shift. A woman had shown up at the crematorium to arrange her own daughter's cremation. According to the documents, the deceased was a young woman. Beautiful. With her whole life ahead of her. Just another tragedy among so many he had already witnessed. But the mother. The mother was different. From the very first moment, she displayed an unusual anxiety. She didn't seem devastated. She didn't cry. She asked no questions about the procedure. Her only interest was speeding everything up. She kept insisting that the cremation be carried out as quickly as possible. They explained repeatedly that there were mandatory documents, authorizations, and legal protocols required before any procedure could begin. But nothing seemed to satisfy her. She insisted. She pressured them. She pleaded. At one point, she even offered money to get them to break the rules. The operator refused immediately. His job security was worth far more than any under-the-table payment. After the first refusal, she persisted. After the second, she raised the offer. After the third, she simply stared at him. It wasn't a look of sadness. Nor of anger. It was something much harder to explain. As if, for a few seconds, she blamed him for something that hadn't even happened yet. The operator felt a shiver run down his spine. When she finally turned her back and left the room, she slammed the door so hard that one of the light fixtures nearly swayed. He stood watching the hallway for a few moments. Beside him, a coworker known as Ivanich simply made a gesture, circling his finger around his head as if to say, "That woman isn't right in the head." The two men went back to work, believing that the encounter ended there. They had no idea that the woman would return just a few hours later. And that, along with her, something would arrive that would turn that night into the most terrifying experience of their lives. The rest of the shift went by normally. At least, that was what they imagined. Late in the afternoon, the crematorium director entered the room where the operators worked. The paperwork had finally been cleared. The young woman's body would be arriving that very night. Her father simply nodded. Just another procedure. Just another cremation. Nothing different from what he did every day. A few hours later, the funeral vehicle pulled up at the back of the building. As they unloaded the coffin, something immediately caught his eye. It could hardly be called a coffin. It was a simple wooden box, made of thin, rough-hewn planks, as if it had been hastily put together. But that, in itself, wasn't all that unusual. Not every family could afford a lavish funeral. And, in the end, all that wood would be consumed by the flames. The problem was something else. As soon as he got close to the box, he noticed an unpleasant smell. A strong odor. Heavy. Unmistakable. It was the smell of decomposition. He frowned. It didn't make sense. Standard procedure required every body to be checked before cremation. It was necessary to verify the person's identity and ensure all documentation was in order. Noticing that the coffin was completely nailed shut, he walked over to the young woman's mother. "I'm sorry. I'll need to open the coffin to check the contents." The woman replied almost immediately. "There's no need." He insisted, explaining that it was part of the crematorium's regulations. Even so, she seemed uncomfortable. Impatient. Almost desperate. It was as if she wanted to prevent anyone from seeing what was inside. As they spoke, he noticed another detail. She didn't even ask to say goodbye to her daughter. She simply said she had already done so earlier. There were no tears. There was no hesitation. No final glance back. Nothing. After a few moments of silence, she asked a question that left him completely taken aback. She spoke softly, so no one else would hear. "Can you throw the ashes away?" It took him a few seconds to answer. He thought he had misunderstood. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath. "After the cremation, can you just get rid of them?" The operator was speechless. In all his years working there, he had never heard a request like that. Usually, families kept the ashes. They scattered them somewhere special. Or buried them. But this woman, she wanted them to disappear. As if even the ashes shouldn't continue to exist. He firmly replied that it was impossible. If she didn't have an urn, she could buy one at the crematorium's own small shop. The woman simply nodded and walked away down the hallway. But as he watched her walk away, a hard-to-explain feeling began to grow inside him. It wasn't pity. Nor anger. It was the impression that the woman was hiding something. Something serious. Very serious. Without wasting any more time, he and Ivanich carried the coffin to the furnace room. They grabbed a crowbar and began prying the nails from the lid. With every hammer blow, the smell grew stronger. The odor was so intense that both men had to turn their faces away for a moment. Ivanich was the first to break the silence. "This isn't right." When the lid was finally removed, they both looked inside. It was indeed a young woman. Very beautiful. Her face was still practically intact. But parts of her body already showed dark patches, especially on her legs and abdomen. Typical signs of decomposition. The operator carefully checked the photograph attached to the documents. It was the same person. Even so, something still felt wrong. He consulted the death certificate again. The date indicated she had died only the day before. He looked at Ivanich. Then he looked back at the body. Neither of them could understand it. Under normal conditions, a corpse shouldn't be in that state after less than 24 hours. Ivanich slowly shook his head. It looks like she's been dead for days. The operator didn't answer. He simply closed the lid again. Perhaps there was a medical explanation. Perhaps the conditions in which the body had been kept had accelerated the process. Or perhaps they simply didn't want to consider the possibility of another answer. The furnace had already reached the ideal temperature. The heavy metal door began to open slowly. The automatic system pushed the coffin into the chamber. The flames engulfed the wood. The door closed. Everything seemed absolutely normal. Convinced the procedure would go just like any other, the operator stepped out for a few minutes to smoke a cigarette. The cold early morning air contrasted with the intense heat radiating from the furnace room. He had barely taken his first drag when he heard hurried footsteps behind him. It was Ivanich. All the color had drained from his face. He was struggling to breathe. It took a few seconds for him to speak. I think I heard someone screaming. The operator let out a soft laugh. He tried to ease the tension. Are you pulling my leg? Ivanich remained motionless. He didn't smile. He didn't answer. He just kept staring at him. And it was at that moment that the operator realized his colleague truly believed what he had just heard. The two of them immediately returned to the furnace room. Unaware that, from that point on, all logic would cease to make sense. The two men quickly crossed the hallway and returned to the furnace room. The atmosphere was strangely quiet. The only sound was the constant hum of the machinery. Ivanich pointed to the small inspection window set into the furnace door. It came from there. The operator took a deep breath and brought his face close to the heat-resistant glass. Inside, something was wrong. The flames had vanished. The coffin remained partially burned, shrouded only in smoke. It was impossible. The furnace operated at extremely high temperatures and rarely malfunctioned. In 7 years, he had never seen the fire simply go out in the middle of a cremation. His first thought was a mechanical failure. He ran to the control panel. He checked the gas pressure, the gauges, the temperature. Everything seemed normal. Even so, he restarted the system. For a few seconds, a metallic roar echoed through the machinery. Then, the flames returned. The two men stood watching through the small window. This time, the fire seemed steady. It must have been a glitch. The operator murmured, more to convince himself than his colleague. But the calm was short-lived. Less than 5 minutes later, the furnace went out again. This time, without any explanation. The two men exchanged glances. The silence spoke volumes. To rule out any doubt, they removed the coffin from the chamber. They decided to test the furnace while completely empty. As soon as they turned the equipment on, the flames appeared immediately. Strong. Uniform. Steady. The system was working perfectly. No defects. No malfunctions. The problem seemed to be tied only to that body. Neither of them voiced what they were thinking, because both had reached exactly the same conclusion, even without the courage to say it aloud. After a few minutes, they placed the coffin back on the conveyor belt. The heavy metal door slowly opened. The wooden box disappeared once more into the flames. This time, however, the operator didn't walk away. He remained in front of the small inspection window, watching every second of the process. The fire began to rapidly consume the wood. Little by little, the flames reached the young woman's body. That was when something happened. At first, he thought it was just an illusion caused by the heat. He blinked a few times. He brought his face even closer to the glass. The girl's hand. It seemed to have moved. It was just a small movement. Almost imperceptible. Like a slight spasm. His heart began to race. Immediately, he tried to find a rational explanation. Perhaps the muscles were reacting to the extreme heat. He had heard similar stories before. Heat could cause involuntary contractions in a corpse. That was it. It had to be that. But before he could convince himself, the furnace shut down for the third time. The red alarm light flashed on the panel. An audible warning began to echo through the room. The operator immediately turned his eyes back to the small window. And in that instant, all the blood seemed to drain from his body. On the other side of the glass, there was a face. Not the young woman's face. That thing. It wasn't human. A completely charred figure stood motionless, staring at him through the window. It was as if it were mere centimeters away. His entire body froze. He simply couldn't breathe. The creature's skin looked like cracked charcoal. Its head was disproportionately large. Where eyes should have been, there were only dark hollows. The mouth. It didn't exist. The entire face seemed covered in a thick layer of burnt flesh. In the center of the face, a deep gash split the head almost in two. And, inside that dark fissure, something was moving. Small, whitish organisms writhed slowly amidst the charred flesh. The operator staggered backward. His legs simply stopped responding. Ivanich sensed his desperation. "What is it?" He tried to answer. No words came out. He merely raised his arm slowly, pointing at the window. Ivanich looked. And froze. Both men remained motionless. Neither said a word. The creature didn't move either. It just watched. As if it knew exactly that it was being watched. Then, without any warning, it vanished. They barely had time to catch their breath. A violent crash shook the entire room. Bang! Another. Bang! Then another. The metal walls vibrated. The heavy furnace door shuddered with every impact. It was as if something were pounding on the steel from the inside. Each blow was harder than the last. The operator instinctively recoiled. Ivanich shouted in desperation. "Turn on the furnace. Turn it on now." But he couldn't react. His brain had simply frozen. Fear had taken complete control. Ivanich ran to the panel and activated the system again. The valves opened. The gas began to circulate once more. Then, an indescribable sound filled the room. It didn't sound like a human scream. Nor did it resemble the roar of an animal. It was a disturbing blend of hundreds of overlapping voices. As if hundreds of people were screaming at once. A low-pitched sound. Deep. Agonizing. So intense it made their chests vibrate. Both men instinctively clapped their hands over their ears. But the sound didn't fade. Quite the opposite. It seemed to echo inside their very heads. And it was at that exact moment that they grasped a terrifying truth. Whatever was inside that furnace was no longer the body of a young woman. And the worst part, it might be trying to get out. For a few seconds, neither of them could move. The roar emanating from the furnace seemed to pierce the concrete walls and vibrate deep within the two men's chests. Then, silence. Absolute silence. For an instant, everything stood still. Until a sharp snap shattered the quiet. Crack. Both men instinctively looked toward the small inspection window. A fine crack had appeared in the heat-resistant glass. It was impossible. The viewing pane was designed specifically to withstand extreme temperatures and massive pressure fluctuations. It should never have broken like that. Before either of them could react, another crack appeared. Then another. And another. Within seconds, the entire surface was covered in a web of tiny fissures. Ivanich took a step back. His face had gone completely pale. "Let's get out of here." He had barely finished the sentence. The glass exploded. Shards flew across the room as a blast of hot air rushed out of the furnace. Instinctively, both men shielded their faces with their arms. When they looked again, inside, there was no one leaning against the opening anymore. The creature had simply vanished. That was when they heard a sound coming from the hallway. A footstep. A dragging sound. Then another. Slow. Heavy. As if the person walking was struggling immensely to move their own body. Neither man needed to say a word. They ran. They raced down the hallway in near total darkness, trying to reach the building's main exit. The operator grabbed the door handle. Locked. He pulled again with all his might. Nothing. He tried the back door. It was locked, too. Despair began to take hold of them both. At that hour of the night, all the administrative staff had already gone home. The director, too. The entire crematorium seemed empty. Or almost empty. Footsteps kept echoing. Always slow. Always steady. As if the person walking knew exactly where they were. Ivanich began to panic. The operator tried to think, but fear seemed to block any logical reasoning. It is curious how the brain reacts in extreme situations. After so many years living with death on a daily basis, he believed nothing could shake him anymore. But in that moment, he was just a man trying to survive. The footsteps drew closer. The two of them ran to a small room used for storage. They rushed inside. They shoved cabinets, boxes, and any heavy objects against the door. Then they turned off the light. The only sound was their rapid breathing. Outside, the footsteps continued. Slow. Dragging. Getting closer and closer. Until they stopped. The silence that followed was even worse. Both men held their breath. Neither dared to make the slightest movement. A few seconds passed. Maybe a minute. Maybe 5. In that situation, time seemed not to exist. Then the footsteps started up again. Moving slowly away now. Ivanich closed his eyes. He took a deep breath. For the first time since it all began, he believed they might be safe. They waited a few more moments. The operator carefully moved aside one of the boxes blocking the door. He turned the handle slowly. He opened it just a few centimeters. He looked out into the hallway. Nothing. Everything seemed empty. He opened it a little wider. He stuck his head out. Absolute silence. He signaled to Ivanich. The two of them stepped out of the room. They took only a few steps. Then, a shadow slowly emerged from around the corner of the hallway. First, the head appeared. Tilted at an impossible angle. Then the shoulders. Next, the rest of the body. The creature remained completely motionless. Watching. Even from a distance, it was clear that its entire body was charred. Chunks of skin seemed to be sloughing off as it stood there. There were no eyes. There was no mouth. Even so, both men were absolutely certain it was staring at them. It was Ivanich who broke the silence. He let out a desperate scream. and took off running. The operator ran right behind him. Neither of them was thinking about grabbing the keys anymore, or about going back to the engine room. They just wanted to escape that place. At the end of the hallway, there was a row of windows facing the parking lot. Without slowing down, the operator threw his body against the glass. The window gave way upon impact. He fell outside. Looking back, he saw Ivanich trying to do the same. But his colleague landed awkwardly. His ankle twisted violently. The scream of pain echoed across the courtyard. For a brief moment, the operator thought about fleeing alone. But he couldn't do it. He ran back. He slipped his arm under his colleague and began to drag him. The two of them staggered along the dark street. When they finally reached a lit avenue and saw cars passing by, a sense of relief began to set in. The operator took a deep breath. He looked back one last time. The figure remained motionless, standing behind the crematorium's broken window. It made no attempt to pursue them. It simply watched, as if it knew that the story was far from over. Ivanich was taken to the hospital for his ankle injury. The operator, in a state of total shock, refused medical attention. He took a taxi. Throughout the entire ride home, he couldn't utter a single word. When he finally walked through the door, his wife and son were still waiting for him. They believed the worst of the night was already over. But the true horror hadn't even begun. When he finished telling the whole story, silence filled the kitchen. No one said a word. The wall clock showed nearly 4 in the morning. The vodka bottle was practically empty. His mother tried to find a rational explanation for what she had just heard. Maybe stress. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe a gas leak had caused hallucinations. But none of these hypotheses seemed convincing, even to the person formulating them. The son, on the other hand, couldn't take his eyes off his father. There was something strange about his behavior. Even while sitting at the table, he kept glancing at the corners of the house, as if expecting something to appear at any moment. His eyes darted toward doors, windows, hallways. They never stayed still. Then, suddenly, he stood up. Without a word, he walked into the hallway and returned holding his cell phone. His hand was still trembling. "You don't have to believe me, but I managed to take a picture." He opened the gallery. For a few seconds, he stared at the screen, as if even he didn't want to see it again. Then he turned the device toward his wife and son. Both of them froze. The image clearly showed the furnace's small inspection window. Reflected in the glass, one could see the operator himself holding the phone. But on the other side, there was another figure. A charred silhouette was staring directly into the camera. Even though it was motionless, it conveyed an indescribable feeling. The son felt a chill run down his spine. He knew his father. He knew he could barely use his phone to make calls. Editing a photo or creating a montage was completely out of the question. If that image was real, then everything he had said might be true, too. No one said another word. Shortly after, his mother went to bed. The father remained seated for a few minutes, in complete silence. When he finally stood up, he walked slowly toward the bathroom. The son remained awake. For some reason, he simply couldn't relax. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed a small detail. The clothes his father had left on the floor seemed to be moving. He stopped. He slowly bent down. He pushed one of the garments aside. And his stomach turned. Among the fabric were small, whitish worms. Larvae. Not many, but enough to make him recoil immediately. He thought about waking his mother. He thought about showing her. But he decided against it. Perhaps it was just a coincidence. Perhaps he was shaken by everything he had just heard. He decided to wait until morning to talk about it. It was the biggest mistake of his life. Even lying in bed, sleep was slow to come. The photograph of the creature kept flashing through his mind. His father's words echoed in his head. Eventually, overcome by exhaustion, he fell asleep. He had no idea how much time had passed when he opened his eyes. It wasn't a noise that woke him. Nor a nightmare. It was the smell. A strong smell of smoke. Mixed with the heat. As he opened his eyes, he saw a dark haze filling his room. He leapt out of bed immediately. He opened the door. The hallway was already engulfed in flames. The fire was consuming the apartment at a terrifying speed. He shouted for his parents. No answer. He covered his face with his t-shirt and tried to move forward. But the heat was unbearable. In his parents' bedroom, he found only destruction. His mother showed no signs of life. His father had vanished. No body. No sign that he had managed to escape. Just an inexplicable void. Staggering, he managed to reach the front door and get out of the apartment before the fire took over everything. Firefighters arrived a few minutes later. They quickly brought the flames under control. Forensics investigated the scene. But they never found any trace of the crematorium operator. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. In the days that followed, the police opened an investigation. Hospitals. Police stations. The morgue. Nothing. No leads. No records. No witnesses. Officially, he remains missing to this day. His mother was buried in the same cemetery where he had worked every day for so many years. But one question never left her son's mind. Why did that woman want so badly to destroy her own daughter's body? She didn't cry. She didn't want a wake. She didn't want a farewell. She didn't want to keep the ashes. She just wanted it all over with as quickly as possible. As if she knew that there was something in that body that should never remain in this world. Perhaps it is all just an unlikely series of coincidences. Perhaps the trauma of that night distorted the survivor's memories. Or perhaps the cremation unleashed something that should never have escaped. Something that found a new host. And which, ever since, has been walking silently among the living. Because, sometimes, true terror lies not in the dead, but in that which refuses to die.